This is the support presentation for Booklet 5 of the GCSE Germany course at Plymstock School. This booklet is on life in Nazi Germany, and unlike the booklets that come before it, this booklet is a collaborative learning unit where the students are responsible for their own learning, for their teaching, and also for providing the revision materials and the teaching activities that go with the unit. This unit is made up of the students studying all these different separate areas of life in Nazi Germany: education, women, the Hitler Youth, and youth resistance. By the end of the unit, the students should be an expert on the unit that they are responsible for, but also by listening to the learning and the presentations of the other groups, they should be experts on the other areas as well. Now, of course, the problem is that we have the concern that they're only going to be specialised in the area that they actually presented on. So the whole booklet needs to be completed by all the students in order to ensure that they know the full breadth of the course. In the booklet, there are separate pages where the students should have made notes on the unit they were responsible for, but also pages where they may have made notes on the presentations that students have given in the other subjects that were under study. Okay. At the end of the unit, they're expected to do this particular area of evaluation as well. This shows the commitment that the department has not just to the teaching of their own subject, but the wider curriculum that students are studying in terms of becoming independent learners. Question analysis. This page is to help them plan the questions that they have been set to answer. So the first section that we have here of life in Nazi Germany deals with education. Now, there is an umbrella concept that runs over the entire course. Once Hitler comes to power in January 1933, he's striving to establish himself as an absolute dictator. This he achieves by August 1934. After August 1934, he's attempting to establish a totalitarian state in Germany. As we go through this booklet, as we go through the rest of the course, students are asked to consider how successful Hitler was in establishing this totalitarian state. So Life in Nazi Germany has the quote that underpins it. By Hugh Trevor Roper, Hitler wanted to establish a society from which even the imagination was to have no means of escape. Most control over Germany, almost all the control over Germany, was never going to be enough. He wanted total, totalitarian control. Nazi education. The sole purpose of schools is to create new Nazis. Now, immediately, that conflicts with the purpose of education that our students are used to. A purpose which is for them to question and them to participate in a liberal democracy. In Nazi Germany, the only purpose of education was to breed the next generation of Nazis, and that next generation of Nazis would help the Nazi state outlive Adolf Hitler. To create his 1,000-year Reich, Hitler would have to educate future generations. Only by controlling the minds of the young could Hitler preserve and protect his new Germany from beyond the grave. To this end, he established a huge organisation to create new Nazis. Education was just one part of this organisation, but when linked with propaganda, control of the family and youth movements, he would invade every part of German life. This would be totalitarianism. Baader von Schirach, the leader of the Hitler Youth, famously said of children in Germany, they will never be free for the rest of their lives. If Hitler could control the children in the school, then from 9 o'clock until the afternoon, those children were under his control. Students are then presented with this timetable for a Berlin schoolgirl. They can identify lessons that look familiar and lessons that are different. The first task is for the students to identify the similar and different subjects that are taught in the German curriculum from their own curriculum. Then we move through questions 1, 2 and 3. How does your timetable compare and education compare to that of a German student under the Nazis? Secondly, what subjects didn't the Nazis teach and why might this be so? And to help here, you'll see that it's the arts that are missing, the humanities that are missing. Any subject that was generating an opinion or an idea that might be contrary to the Nazis had no place in their curriculum. The purpose of education was to create Nazis, not people who would question and challenge them. In question 3, do you think a boy's timetable or subject content would differ from the girls and why? Well, obviously they've learnt that the boys' timetable was more physical. Whereas girls were drilled to become mothers and housewives, the boys were always being drilled to become the leaders and the soldiers in Germany. Now, using the textbook, students are now required to go through each of the subject that was taught in the Nazi curriculum, and using that, their job is then to tell me what the content of the curriculum is and why the Nazis wanted that kind of pupil. So in PE, physical exercise, team sports. The reason why they wanted this is to prepare the students for a life and a career in the armed forces. In history, it would be German history that was taught. German history with the bits the Nazis didn't find palatable edited out. The reasons being is they wanted to brainwash children. And we've already demonstrated in class that history is a very political subject where governments choose what goes in and what is left out. In biology, they would have been taught about eugenics, how the boys were taught to keep fit, how the girls were taught to keep healthy in order to be able to bear the next race of Germans. They would also be taught how to identify the ideal characteristics in a partner for the future. That was this policy of eugenics, which links back to Charles Darwin, the law of the jungle. Social Darwinism was a key part of what the Nazis believed in. Why? They wanted the 1,000-year Reich. They wanted to establish a regime that would survive. In German, the students would have been taught German literature. In the way that Shakespeare is taught in English lessons, the equivalents would be taught in German. There would be a distinct bias towards military subjects and the glorification of war. The reason being is preparing boys and girls for a life in the German armed forces. And finally, in geography, students would be taught about the lands that were lost during the Treaty of Versailles, the injustices of the land that was taken away, and also the need for Germany to establish living space in the East so Germany would have the chance to expand in the future. The reasons behind this was a process of slow brainwashing. Put all these topics together and you start to control the input that goes into children's minds. Remember, there was very little in terms of material that the students could access outside of school. Germany was poor, few libraries, few children would have had enough money to have had books of their own, no internet, no TV, and the radio, as they've already learnt, was highly controlled by the Nazis. Question 3. I would like the students to identify the qualities that the Nazis looked for in their students. Circle the correct ones. In question 4, it's already been gone through in the presentations, but I want to see how students understand how the Nazi ideology is reflected even in the exam questions. Using the textbook, there are examples, certainly in maths, of how mathematical problems are set in a military context. Again, slowly but surely brainwashing the children. And question 5 is a study of how the Jewish children were affected by Nazi changes in education. The second topic is the Hitler Youth. The weak must be chiselled away. I want young men and women who can suffer pain. A young German must be as swift as a greyhound, as tough as leather, and as hard as Krupp's steel. Adolf Hitler. As we've seen, Hitler knew the 1,000-year Reich could only be built with the young and future generations. In school they were indoctrinated, and when they were outside they were brainwashed even further. Like some kind of super scout organisation, boys were drilled in physical and military training whilst the girls were trained for a life of childbearing and family service. By 1936, the Nazis had taken over all youth movements and used them to control the minds of Germany's youth. The Hitler Youth Oath demonstrates the role that the youth would have in fulfilling Hitler's totalitarian dreams. To the saviour of our country, Adolf Hitler, I am willing and ready to give up my life for him, so help me God. Many members of the Hitler Youth, it should be remembered, were the final defenders of Berlin in 1945 and fulfilled their oath to him. Membership. Hitler's attempt to control the youth was a gradual process reflecting his increasing control of Germany. As students will see in the remaining booklets, Hitler doesn't have totalitarian control from the outset in 1934. He gradually builds up his total control over Germany. And the graph down here shows how this happens. Starting from 1933, we can see there's a massive explosion in the amount of children that are joining the Hitler Youth. The reason being, obviously, it was very, very popular to join the party's youth organisation once the Nazis had come to power. Before that, they weren't anywhere near as popular. As we move through the years, we can see that the membership of the youth organisations and the youth movement increases onwards and upwards. Students down here are to identify, by looking at this graph, the trends of what is going on. The interesting thing to note, however, is the gap here between the potential membership and the amount of children that actually did. Now, to any scout leader today, this is an awful achievement, to be able to get so many children joining the Hitler Youth. What's significant to a totalitarian like Hitler, however, is the gap. Around 1.5 million children could and should have joined the Hitler Youth, but didn't do so. This should be borne out when we think about resistance, youth resistance, later in this booklet, because it's in that 1.5 million that the Nazis faced their real problem with children resisting their ideas. I then want the students to interpret that graph. Is it showing total, virtual, partial or weak control? And again, reflecting this aim of a totalitarian state. How happy will the Nazi youth leader be looking at this data? Then, from what they've studied, through the posters and through the textbook, I want 3 ideas for why the children were attracted to the Hitler Youth. Certainly the idea to poor city boys, the idea of going out camping in the countryside, being taught how to drive cars, being given a uniform, would have been extremely attractive. We then have ideas like patriotism and the peer pressure that was put on to the children by other kids, but also pressure from parents. I then want students to look at pages 130 to 133 and work their way through the 4 questions here, looking at life inside the Hitler Youth. The activities that students were undertaking, examples that to us looking back were obvious attempts to indoctrinate and brainwash boys. Why on earth letters had to be handed in unsealed, linking that back to the booklet that we've already studied on the police state, and why might the boy have informed on his own grandfather in 1937? And as students do question 4, I would urge them to go back to the quote at the start of the booklet on the oath that the Hitler Youth took. Youth resistance. Now, of those 1.5 million students that didn't join the Hitler Youth, some actively resisted. Now, later on in the course, we will look at youth resistance as part of the wider resistance and opposition in Germany. And we introduce the students to concepts of resistance: passive, overt, and active. Passive being resistance where students and children thought the wrong things. Active resistance, where the children or adults looked to one another and spoke to one another. Really significant step there in resisting the Nazis. And thirdly, the overt level of resistance, where individuals, where children and adults actively resisted the Nazis by using force or printing pamphlets or broadcast radio illegally. The German name will remain forever dishonoured unless German youth rises at last to crush its torturers. From a pamphlet printed by the White Rose organisation. As we have seen, not all children joined the Hitler Youth. Most kept a low profile. However, a small minority actively resisted the Nazis in various ways. I'd like the students to interpret the picture here, give some idea of what happened when children didn't join the Hitler Youth. And secondly, how is this poster itself resisting the Nazis? Now, within Germany, there were 3 main resistance groups that the children need to know about: the Swing Youth, the Edelweiss Pirates, and the White Rose Group. I want the students to be able to identify the key features of each of these groups, but also have an idea on which ones were the bigger threat to the Nazis, because of not only how the Nazis punished them, but what these students and children actually did. The Swing Youth was more of a fashion than it was an organised movement. I'd like 6 features of the Swing Youth. And then if the students could analyse by identifying the one that would hurt and annoy the Nazis the most with an explanation of their reason. The Edelweiss Pirates and the White Rose group, however, went further than the Swing Youth. They were probably smaller in numbers, but much more focused in their aims and the means by which they would go about achieving them. The White Rose group are a group that used their brains to protest, with the printing press and the pamphlets, university and college graduates. The Edelweiss Pirates used force and were prepared to be a lot more disruptive. Which of the groups, therefore, would the Nazis fear the most? Choose one, explain your choice. Students can then look at the punishments that were meted out to each of these groups as a means of determining just how much of a threat they were to the Nazis. The textbook can help with this, but any search on the internet for any of those three groups would give you information on how they were punished by the Nazis. And from that, you can glean an idea of which ones the Nazis found to be the greater threat. Women in Germany. Women make up half the population, normally. In Germany, in the 1930s, it was even higher because so many men had died during the Great War. Even though our weapon is only the soup ladle, its impact should be as great as that as other weapons. Gertrude Schultz-Klink, who was the head of Hitler's women's organisation. Just like their children in school and husbands in industry and the army, women too were singled out for a new role in Germany. Hitler summed up his ideas when he said that women should stick to the 3 Ks. Kinder, Kirche, Küche. Children, church and cooking. I don't really think that Hitler was a sexist in the sense that he thought women were lesser than men. But Hitler has very, very strong views on the idea of role that people should play within society. And students have already had explained to them the notion of the body politic, where Hitler is the eyes and the brain. The army are the fists and the feet, and the women are the reproductive parts of the living Germany. He regarded, from what I understand, women and men to be equal, but their battles lay in different areas. The men had their battlefield in war, and the women had that in raising children. What I'd like students to do is to work their way through these statements and identify which part of German history, be it Weimar, early Nazi Germany, or Nazi Germany at war, that each of these statements apply to. As we go over the page, these headings should clarify where the statements go. Students know from Booklet 1 that in 1919 to 1925 it was the Weimar Republic that was in power in Germany. And the Weimar Republic was a liberal, tolerant democracy. Women were given equality and essentially anything goes. Any statements that would appear to show equality of women would be in there. When the Nazis come to power, they apply Hitler's beliefs about the role of women. So, when women are removed from the workforce, women are removed from the professions and sent back home to raise children, it's these statements that would go in this particular section. However, from 1939 to 1945, Germany finds itself at war. When the men go off to fight the war, there are serious manpower and labour shortages in Germany. Now the Nazis become pragmatic. Although they never go back to the completely free and equality ideas that were typical of the Weimar Republic, women are allowed a latitude of freedom that they didn't experience during the early years of the Nazis. This is an example of the Nazis being pragmatic, bending in the breeze, making concessions when required. As students look from 1919 through to 1945, I'd like a general impression of the change. I've illustrated this already going back. We go from freedom, very much more repressed and controlled, to greater freedom during the war. I'd like then students to interpret whether there was a greater change between 1925 and 35, or between 35 and 45. Again, the space is provided for a full reason. And then, which change? From the Weimar Republic to the early Nazis, or from the Nazis to the war? Which of those would the women most resent? It is worth bearing in mind. There's very little evidence to suggest that women actually fought back against Nazi ideas of their role in society. one needs to remember that, of course, anyone raised in Germany, any woman raised in Germany before 1919, would have never expected the freedoms that they got under the Weimar Republic. So it's quite possible when the Nazis sent women back to the kitchen, the home and the church, it's quite possible they were willing to accept it because that's what they'd always been raised to expect. The Weimar Republic was definitely the exception to the rule in Germany. Germany had been traditionally a male-dominated dictatorship, not a liberal democracy where women had equality. Now, analysing everything they've done, would you regard the Weimar's policy towards women as sexist, tolerant or repressive? Circle the one. And would you regard the Nazi policy as sexist, tolerant or repressive? And whatever your choice is, would you please kindly annotate your reason why around the outside? Now back to the textbook, using page 136, 3 examples of how women had succeeded under the Weimar government. Again, students could easily go back to the table and lift out examples of female success. On taking power in 1933, what most alarmed the Nazis into forcibly changing the role of women? Well, if I'm clear on this point, there was a serious population dip because of World War I. The birth rate, because of the poverty that Germany experienced at the end of the war and in 1923, and then again in 1929, there were not enough children in Nazi Germany. Hitler needed children, Hitler needed a population that he could mobilize for war. The Nazis were seriously alarmed at the declining birth rate in Germany, but alarmed equally by the rising birth rate amongst their future prospective enemies. This can then be explained, and then when the students study the policies that the Nazis brought in, tax benefits, medals, the fact that women were expected to have seats given up for them on buses, depending on how many children they had, which of those policies would have been the most persuasive and why? Gearing up for war, how did Nazi policies change in 1937? Did the Nazis achieve their aim of increasing the number of marriages? Was the population rising? Again, using page 138, I need students to interpret the information on that page. And finally, number 4, why might there have been more marriages in 1939? It's a trend across the world. When men go to war, they marry their sweethearts, they marry their girlfriends. The reason being, it's a form of protection. The wife will be protected in a way that an unmarried partner wouldn't be. So the marriage rate soared in 1939 when, in September, Hitler invades Poland. Throughout the 1930s, the Nazis both increased the birth rate and got more women to working. Does this suggest that their plans were a success? So interpreting everything that we've seen about their policies towards women, yes, partially, or no, with an explanation. And finally, insight into what the role of women in Nazi Germany was meant to be. A 52-year-old pure Aryan physician, doctor, a fighter at the Battle of Tannenberg in World War I, wishing to settle down, desires male offspring through civil marriage with a young, healthy virgin of pure Aryan stock, undemanding, suited to heavy work, and thrifty, careful with her money, with flat heels, without earrings, if possible without money. No marriage brokers, secrecy guaranteed. Now, if this is an advert that appeared in a Nazi publication during the 1930s, what does it tell us about what men expected women to be and what women were aspiring to be in Germany? Describe in your own words the kind of woman this doctor wanted to marry. For what reasons do you think the doctor wanted to be married? It's an interesting one. Can you think of a reason why the doctor preferred his future wife to have no money? How likely do you think the doctor was to find a wife through this advertisement? Be careful, don't judge according to our own strict standards. This was much more commonplace in Germany than you could probably give credit to. Finally, do you think an advert like this would be allowed in a paper today, despite us living in a liberal democracy? Now this brings us back to the start of the booklet. It's my intention that the students will now be tested not only on their own knowledge of their own section of the course, but they will also need to be tested on how well they have learnt about the other sections of this course of life in Germany. To help them, there are plenty of resources on the school's shared area. There are plenty of sources that can be found via the GCSE Germany link at www.gcse.de. www.historynetwork.co.uk. And also there are resources, MP3 resources, in much greater detail available from the school shared area. Now I need students to know that the independent learning that they've done is all well and good if they've learnt their own section, but they were also expected to actively learn from the presentation and the work that other students were doing. In just filling out the booklet, I don't want students to be confusing that writing is the same as learning.